years ago, long before I became a Marshall Scholar and moved to England, long before some of these people were born. Which is to say, long before BritVox, long before Pottermania, long before you could binge watch all 6 seasons of Downton Abbey at one time. I was a child, Anglophile. I looked the part, all things British. My mother dressed me up, and there's a photograph I found recently. I think I'm 3. I'm wearing a navy peacoat and a matching tam o' shanter with a red pom-pom. I have a very prim expression on my face, and over my arm I'm carrying a little red handbag. I look just like the Queen Mum. All I'm missing are the corgis. My dolls and stuffed animals may or may not have spoken with British accents. They may or may not have said things like, "Jolly good," and "Don't let's quarrel." Blame it on my mother, who dressed me up, Mummy, I called her, who bought me books. I read all the Penguin Puffin classics, Peter Pan and Peter Rabbit, The Secret Garden and Treasure Island, Mary Poppins and Alice in Wonderland and Winnie the Pooh. I loved the Chronicles of Narnia. Tolkien, not so much, sorry. I plowed through stacks of less well-known titles, too, and one of my favorites was a book I'm pretty sure no one here has ever read, although there are a few English people in the crowd. It was a novel by Elizabeth Goudge called Linnets and Valerians. And it's the story of 4 siblings whose mother has passed away, and their father goes off to Egypt, and they end up in the care of their eccentric Uncle Ambrose, because, of course, who sets out to give them an unconventional education with a capital E, involving nature, magic, history, and bees, my favorite things. I would have loved to be one of the Linnet siblings. There was nothing British about my family. But my father had 2 cousins who lived in London. My grandfather's younger sisters had escaped to England after the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia during the war, and we visited my cousins a couple times when I was growing up. My father's cousin Anthony owned what the British call a garage in Bromley, and he would drive us around in these beautiful Bentleys and Rolls Royces, these gleaming hood ornaments and odometers that had been neatly rigged. Anthony organized outings to the country, tickets to the National Theatre. We toured the great food halls at Harrods, bought tins of tea at Fortnum and Mason, scarves at Liberty's, this is one of them, and for me at Marks and Spencer, underpants and socks. By the time I arrived in England with my cohort of Marshall Scholars in September 1984, I figured I'd fit right in. I'd read all the books by then. I'd majored in British history and literature. My first boyfriend a couple years earlier was a rugby-playing Brit. I knew all about cucumber sandwiches with the crusts cut off and semi-detached houses in Royal Ascot and Marmite and Spam. But really, I think I imagined graduate school at Oxford as being kind of like college, only with a much nicer accent. The accents were very nice, but things went downhill from there. My rooms at St. John's College, Oxford, were cold and a little dingy, and the bathroom was freezing, and the showers barely worked. All the stereotypes suddenly seemed true. The other American students were loud and brash, and the British students unfriendly and standoffish. Even the police were less than welcoming when I went to register as a resident alien, grilling me on what I really thought about the Brits. I was 21. I'd never lived more than 12 miles away from home before. I was lonely. I missed my boyfriend back in Boston, to whom I wrote stupid, whiny letters, and because it took years in those days to get a telephone, placed expensive phone calls from the British Telecom phone box by the Martyrs' Memorial in St. Giles. And there, beneath Oxford's famous dreaming spires, I felt displaced, adrift. But I was in England to do a master's degree. I was doing an MPhil in international relations. At our first meeting, my supervisor handed me a fat reading list. It must have been 100 pages long, and he informed me of the date of our qualifying exam, 8 months out. I asked him if he had any recommendations for what I might read to prepare, and he looked surprised. Well, he said, I wouldn't really know, would I? Some people like to read biographies, and some people like to read history. That's for you to figure out. Since he wasn't very helpful, I decided to go meet with the director of the program, another famous professor. The first question he asked me was, what did I plan to write my thesis on? I'd been there about 2 weeks. We had 2 years. I told him truthfully that I didn't know yet. The famous professor scowled. I didn't know what I wanted to write my thesis on. He made it clear that he didn't know what I was doing in the program and that I was wasting both my time and his. I got the message. This was graduate school. This was Oxford. I was on my own. Nobody was going to help me. But the worst part of it was that my professors were right. I didn't know what I wanted to write about, and I had no idea how I was going to figure it out. All I knew was that I had won this amazing, prestigious scholarship, but I felt like a loser and a fake. In November, my family came to visit. We went to London. We stayed with Cousin Anthony. We went to the theater. We went to museums, and of course, we went shopping. And one day, my mother and I found ourselves on the top floor of Fortnum & Mason's beautiful Victorian department store in Piccadilly. But when we stepped into the elevator, it was a very ancient wood-paneled lift. It didn't seem to want to work. The doors closed and then jerked open and closed and open, and the elevator kind of bounced in a way that didn't feel exactly safe. I couldn't decide if I should grab my mother and run out of the elevator and walk down the 4 flights of stairs or stay put and possibly plummet to our deaths. It seemed like yet another English thing that just didn't quite work the way it should. Typical English elevator, I muttered not so softly under my breath. The woman standing next to me wheeled around. Well, she said, if you don't like it here, why don't you go back where you came from? My cheeks burned. Finally, the elevator doors closed and we descended and got out. My mom was annoyed at the way the woman had spoken to me, but I just felt ashamed. I knew that she too was right. For many years, I told the story of my elevator comeuppance as a kind of epiphany, as the turning point, the moment when I realized that I better just shut up and stop complaining and be grateful for the incredible privilege that I had, the moment that jolted me out of my culture shock. But now I'm not so sure that culture shock really was my problem back then in the fall of 1984. Now that I look back, it's the elevator woman's question, it's my professor's questions that keep repeating in my head. What was I doing there in England? What did I like to read? What did I want to write? Who did I want to be? The truth was, I'd never really asked myself those questions, not really. I was a good girl. I'd always done what other people wanted. In fact, I was so good at it that no one ever had to tell me what to do. My superpower was being able to intuit what they wanted and then to make it seem as if what they wanted was what I wanted, even when that wasn't the case, which honestly might have been most of the time. I had no idea. Because in the place where my own authentic desire should have been, there was an empty space, a gap. Mind the gap. How often have you walked right past those words down in the tube, or in New York it says, watch the gap? You probably didn't even know that that sign was there because you don't go in the subway. But it turns out that little gap between the platform and the subway car in curved stations is actually kind of dangerous, even in New York. It's on the transfer in Times Square. In London, according to Transport for London, between 2023 and 2024, 247 people were hurt when they fell into the gap. 247, I mean, there are millions of passengers, but still. In one YouTube video I watched, a little kid slips into the gap and completely disappears right beneath the train. But the thing about the gap is it's not very big, and most people can step right over it. So it's not the gap that's dangerous, it's the lapse in mindfulness that's the risk. And that fall of my first year in England, I didn't even know there was a gap between what I wanted and what other people wanted, between my desire and their expectations. I caught my foot on it and tripped. In the novel I mentioned earlier, Linnets and Valerians, Uncle Ambrose says to the children, now you're free to go where you like. You're free to do as you like. The narrator reflects that the children had never been told such a thing before. I'm not sure I was ever told such a thing before, but it seems to be now that The freedom to go and do as you like is an essential part of any education, with or without a capital E, an essential part of growing up. But the thing about gaps is you don't outgrow them. They're always there. And even now, all these years on, I'm still minding the gap. I'm still asking myself those questions. Where do I want to live? What do I want to write? Who do I want to be? Thank you.